My name is Francisco-Fernando Granados. I have been a visual artist since 2005. I was born in Guatemala and came to Canada as a refugee claimant with my family in 2001. At the end of that refugee process, which took about 4 years, I have a memory of receiving the news that my family and I were going to be allowed to stay in the country, that we were becoming convention refugees, going home and looking up the local fine arts program in Vancouver, which was a program at a college called MacLaren College. And so even though I don't think I realized it at the time, I think for me, the decision to become an artist is sort of not just deeply connected with the refugee journey, but also deeply connected with the process of being able to go from refugee to citizen. So a lot of my work, I think, deals with that transition, with that subjective transition from somebody who's been displaced to somebody who finds a place, and then what it means to come into citizenship. During the first about 10 years of my practice, I worked very intensely in performance art, doing non-narrative, durational actions, architectural interventions, and then about 10 years into my practice, right around the time when I started teaching pretty full time and other things shifted in my life, I moved away from performance and I started reconnecting with my foundation training in drawing and the things that I learned from a very sort of classical, formal education in painting. And that's resulted in a body of work that looks at abstraction, not necessarily from a traditional perspective, but that tries to look at abstraction from a site-specific, context-responsive, queer, and perhaps much more flexible and fluid perspective. The two sets of works that are presented in Fortitude Fragile mark two very different points in my practice. We were joking during the opening that one of the works, the little books, Studies in Minor Abstraction, is so new that I was still making it 18 hours before the show opened. And then the dedication, which is the video performance that is shown across from it, was made 18 years ago when I was 22, when I was a very young person. I'm very grateful to Magda Gonzalez Mora, the curator, for bringing these works together, because even though they come from such different times in my practice, they both deal with process, repetition, duration, endurance as means of making work that in a way is not just a one-off, or it's not just something that comes out, gets on a wall, and then the work is over. I think they're both works that are processes that are woven into everyday life that then emerge in a particular form, are able to be exhibited, but in a way they continue to exist just as part of my practice, as part of life. In the case of the dedication, I think of it as a kind of living poem. I think of it as a wordplay that turns into abstraction, but then also holds some pretty serious political meaning, meaning that has changed over the 18 years that the work has been has existed. And Studies in Minor Abstraction emerges from a series of drawings that I've been making for about the last 8 years, called Letters, which are 8.5 by 11 digital drawings made on a tablet that all begin with the same format, and that I think of as a kind of ongoing abstract correspondence. I think experiences of queerness and experiences of migration, experiences of having been a refugee, share this relationship to frames of recognition, share a relationship to demands to make yourself understandable in front of systems of power. And so I think my practice has always tried to negotiate that boundary between visibility and impossibility, perhaps trying to create different queer strategies that use abstraction not necessarily as a way to, claim autonomy, not necessarily in a kind of modernist way that tries to deny that the aesthetic exists in a context, but as a means of resistance, perhaps, as a means of resisting ways of being pinned down, as a way of resisting, questions that come, that attempt to put you in your place. So this frame of visibility and invisibility helps me think about performance and helps me think about the work of the artist, not just in terms of what is seen and what is visible, but in terms of everything that leads to that process. For me, performance is any kind of artwork where the time and the place of the making of the work is the same as the time and the place of the exhibiting of the work. And so, and that to me is a kind of labor ethic. But obviously, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of labor that goes unseen, that is invisibilized in a lot of artwork. There's artwork that can seem very easy, but has in fact gone through a very rigorous process, a very long process. For me, an obscene action is a way of framing labor that is not always necessarily apparent in the work. It's also a queer intuition, and a rethinking of obscenity beyond the ways in which that word has been used to criminalize us queer people, and as a way of thinking about, all the work that happens beyond what can be recognized. I have been engaged in a everyday practice of drawing digitally through this series called Letters for about the past 8 or 9 years. And that series of drawings has formed an archive of more than about 1,000 drawings at this point that exist as digital files. These drawings, the letters, exist as digital files, and that I then am able to materialize in different ways depending on the context. So compositions from the Letter series have been materialized as 8.5 by 11 archival prints that hang in a gallery wall in a very traditional way, but they have also been materialized as site-specific installations or architectural interventions. And so, in a way, these letters, these compositions had been expressed as traditional artworks, and they had been expressed as sort of large-scale, spatial installations. And I guess I wanted to find a much more intimate, everyday scale to really materialize these compositions. And so it was actually in conversation with a fellow artist and friend, Ron Siu, who is actually somebody who graduated from OCAD University. We were talking about queer images and the nature of queer images. And in that conversation, I started thinking about what would happen if I started printing some of these drawings on one side of a kind of regular home inkjet printer sheet of paper, and then a queer image on the other side. And so I started making studies for these double-sided images, and then I started to fold in a very rough way into a book shape. Eventually I realized that perhaps the letters, the compositions from the letter series were queer enough to sort of hold both sides of the paper. And in fact, when those full compositions began to be folded and cut and began to kind of meet each other in unexpected ways as they became books, that feeling of the queerness of the image really sort of came through. And so I was talking to Magda about the exhibition. I was also in a process in the PhD that I'm doing at Toronto Metropolitan University, thinking a lot about my work in the context of queer abstraction. And so I decided that I would take this impulse to make these little drawings, and I would basically turn it into this obscene performance, that I would turn it into this process that would be woven into my everyday life, and that we would show them as part of Fortitude Fragile. I think abstraction, in the way that I try to work with it, can be a good vehicle to talk about the politics of migration, the politics of absence, the politics of everything that is not necessarily there. But I think the thing that attracts me to the task of folding abstraction, bending abstraction, working with abstraction, not as a kind of monolith, but as a kind of text that can wrap itself around different contexts, is that it doesn't only allow me to talk about pain. It doesn't only allow me to talk about violence. It also allows me to talk about pleasure. It allows me to talk about joy. It allows me to talk about community and sharing. And I think that's something that's been really important for me in finding particular contexts for these compositions. So the more classic way in which one of my compositions may appear would be as a kind of traditional 8.5 by 11 print on a wall. But for a project that I worked on in Vancouver through SFU Galleries, we decided to turn 2 of those compositions into these large-scale murals that would exist in one of the public spaces on campus, where people from the university, but also just people from the community, go and hang out, because it's one of the few spaces in downtown Vancouver where people can go and sit and sort of spend extended periods of time hanging out without necessarily buying anything. There's another project that I worked on called Foreward, which was a year-long project at the MacLaren Art Centre in Barrie, where we created site-specific interventions based on some of these drawings. So the drawings were translated into vinyl prints that went from one of the walls of the gallery inside of their permanent collection display. Then we did a second iteration, which was a sort of line translation of one of the drawings in one of the glass doors into the gallery. And then the third movement in that project was a translation of a drawing for the window. So where basically the work was moving from the gallery through the door and out the window. So I think there's a desire to make abstraction dance, to make abstraction move. And I think as an artist, I think there's a desire to break the binary between form and content, which I think is something that many of us grapple as this conflict, between wanting to think in terms of beauty, wanting to think in terms of affect, wanting to capture things that there's no words for, but also I think being embodied beings in a political context. For me, a way of doing that is to not just think about form and content, but to really think about context as a primary element in the making of the work. The dedication is a love poem. The dedication is a prayer that emerges out of grief. The dedication is the name of love in Spanish, so the conjugation of the verb to love in Spanish. It is also the name of somebody who would have been beloved. And it is a part of my history that happened a long time ago, and a work that was really important to make because it allowed me to take feelings that were overwhelming me at the time and give it a form that didn't necessarily solve the feelings narratively, but that gave it a conduit. And I think a lot of the work that I made after the dedication was informed by that work because it showed me the importance of lyricism, the importance of poetics, but also the importance of committing, in a way committing to your obsessions as a way of shifting away from them. The dedication is also a space between languages. It's a phrase in Spanish that, if you hear it as an English speaker, might not necessarily have the connotation of love, but it might have a much more political connotation, and I was interested in a way in reclaiming that political connotation and making it personal and making it about love. For me, art is the conjugation between form, content, and context. I'm really interested in the ways in which a gesture in a particular context can come across as abstract. But then if that context shifts, or if time and history inflect themselves upon that gesture, they can come to be understood in a different way. I first made the dedication in 2008 in a context that where political violence had emerged in really particular ways after I arrived in Canada, with military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, with racism and Islamophobia being used as an excuse, to bring us politically to many of the issues around xenophobia, racism, hatred of migrants that we're seeing now. And I think part of what I wanted to do was to face some of these political issues head on, but not allow these issues to be defining either of me as a queer refugee person trying to move through them, nor of the sort of communities, that were targeted by these by this violence, both communities that I'm a part of and communities that I'm in solidarity with. So abstraction in a way comes in and out, and in a way I think abstraction is also dependent on, as a viewer, what kind of background you come into the work with. And I'm really interested in an audience member being able to approach a work and having an encounter with it without necessarily an understanding that they can put language to, but also, there are people who can see the work and understand something of where it comes from, understand something of why I might have made it. And I'm interested in, Roland Barthes calls it the pleasure of understanding and of being understood. But of course, there's absolutely no guarantee for this. It's the word in deconstructive theory for this relationship to the audience that I'm really interested in is telepoiesis, which is a phrase by Jacques Derrida that Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, the literary critic, uses. And telepoiesis means touching the distant other with imaginative effort. And I think touching a distant other with imaginative effort is both the goal of what I hope my work can do, both in performance and in abstraction, but also perhaps more broadly, what it means to make art, to be in contact with people who I cannot know in ways I cannot predict, to touch their sensibility, and to share that moment of feeling. I had the privilege of working on the body of work that is shown here at Fortitude Fragile, alongside making work for another exhibition called Diasporic Affections that was happening in Montreal at SBC Gallery. It's a really fantastic project curated by a Chilean-Quebecois poet called Nicholas Dawson. And so it's been actually a really wonderfully intense and busy time being a part of group exhibitions that put my work in the context of diasporic communities, in the context of queer communities, in a cross-cultural context. And so that exhibition just wrapped up. The exhibitions ran concurrently, but there is a lovely year-long correspondence that the curator and I shared, sending drawings and notes and photographs back and forth that's available, that they've made available through the Curatorial Collective's website that co-organized with Nicholas. I am also working on a large-scale permanent public art installation at Base Station in collaboration with my boyfriend and the love of my life, architect Kurt Krahler. So that public art project is a translation of a set of drawings from the letter series that will go on to become a vitreous glass mosaic in the Cumberland entrance of Base Station. So that's a pretty big project, and it's a kind of a long-term project, and it's a very different way of working, a very different scale for working. Other than that, I'm currently a PhD candidate in Toronto Metropolitan University's Media and Design Innovation program. And so I'm in the process of, as part of that work, not just continuing my practice and using the PhD as a way to ask epistemological questions from the practice, but also I'm in the process of looking back at almost 20 years of published writing, some of which I did right around the time of the dedication. dealing with the way in which refugees appear in the public sphere, and ways in which refugees have been framed in public discourse. I'm looking at writing that I've done over a very long period of time, and I'm hoping to gather some of that writing into something that could eventually be published as a more coherent, cohesive statement. Right after I finished my master's degree at the University of Toronto, my first job and the thing that kept a roof over my head for about 10 years after I finished school, before going back to do my PhD, was teaching in both first year and in the criticism and curatorial programs, undergraduate programs at OCAD University in the Faculty of Art. And so it's an honor and it's a joy to be able to show my work at onsite in the context of the OCAD community, because a big part of Toronto becoming my home is woven in with the years that I've spent being a part of this educational community, teaching alongside incredible artists, meeting incredible emerging artists in classrooms, and as years went by, watching them become full-fledged professionals making really great contributions to the community. So it feels really special to not just be able to show work in the city that I live, but also in the context of a community where I spent 10 years working really hard, teaching and helping contribute to the community.